Okay, let's see when we are live. I think we're live actually. So, welcome everybody to a new edition of Cannamonitor webinar. This one, very, very interesting one. We have a big expert, Mike Barnes, out of the UK, and we are going to discuss a lot of new data on the British market that has been published in the last few weeks. How are you doing today, Mike?
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for asking me. And thank you also for your work in this field, because you're one of the few people who produce this market intelligence, which we badly need to make decisions going forward. So thank you for your work that you do in this field. It's much appreciated.
Really appreciated, Mike. And actually, I mean, you are, of course, a reference not only in the UK, but I would say in Europe and internationally, because of course you were highly involved in the 2018 push to get medical cannabis accessible to British patients. You have been involved in the Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society. You have been involved with drug science in the 2021 access scheme. So
Yeah.
you have been a pivotal and a central figure in the British market. So thank you so much for all your work. And also, I think that today we're going to discuss some trends that are very, very relevant, and you can give us also an on-the-ground perspective, also from a prescriber point of view. So I really appreciate your presence here, Mike.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, and I must say that the data that we're going to discuss comes from Freedom of Information requests that have been published over the last few weeks, but there was a lot of work also, 3 weeks of work by Cannamonitor, because it's over 150,000 item lines, let's say, that we had to almost manually match to specific products. But in the end, I think the data is really interesting, and this is available to all our subscribers in our platform. So if you want to access the data, I have some free offerings, also some paid offerings. Do not hesitate to ask for it. But we have, like always, just 1 hour, very packed session. We have 10 slides, but very, very packed slides. So I don't want to lose any more time with introductions. Mike, are you fine with going ahead into it?
Yes, let's have a look at this data.
Of course. But first, I would like to take a step back and look at the UK marketing context, because it's been already almost 8 years since it was first available in November 2018. And of course, many things have changed, both in the UK, but also internationally. One of the big ones would be, of course, German legalization in 2024, which brought a massive increase of the pharmacy channel, let's say, and the medical cannabis market in Germany. And now I'm seeing some talks also in the UK regarding possible liberalization also of the sector, similar to that. So do you think, Mike, that is the UK following the same trend as Germany of legalizing cannabis through the pharmacy? And what do you think are the main opportunities and the main challenges in the UK market as of 2026?
That's a good. Are we moving towards legalization? I think general legalization. I think the answer to that is no, to be honest. First of all, there's no political appetite either from the two parties, and now, of course, we've got 5 parties in the UK. 2 of those, the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, are probably open to much more looking carefully at drug policy reform generally, which would probably include legalization of cannabis recreationally and opening up the medical market. The other main parties are not, basically. So are we seeing it creeping in? I think no is the answer. Although we've got, as we'll talk about later, Arnau, we've got nearly 100,000 patients in the UK. That barely touches even the medical illegal market, which is probably certainly in excess of about 1.2, 1.3 million people. So we're really only seeing still probably 5-6% of the total medical market. So we'll get there in terms of bigger numbers, but I don't think it'll be that quick unless we happen to get a coalition government that involves the Greens and the Liberal Democrats in the UK, which may happen. So I'm a little bit more pessimistic about major cannabis legalization changes than others are. It will happen, but it's not going to happen quickly in the UK.
That's very interesting. Yeah, sorry.
You asked me what I saw the risks. I don't think there's a risk. The risks, it's not really a risk. I think we're going to see slow, steady growth as we have done for the last 7.5, nearly 8 years. It's been pretty well a straight line growth. And I think we're going to continue to see straight line growth. we're not seeing what they call the hockey stick growth that happened in Australia and Canada, where it's pretty low for 2 or 3 years and shoots and takes off. We've not seen that, and I don't think we're going to see that. I think we're going to see steady growth for another 4 years, and then I think it will plateau off. Are the risks in the short term, the other question you asked, and there might be. There's been a little bit of interest from the press in the last couple of months in the UK, a bit negative press around cannabis following the very sad death of one patient. And some of the press have got onto that and said we should regulate the market more strictly. That may happen, but I think if anything, we'll see a more tighter regulation about severe mental health prescribing, maybe. And maybe that's not a bad thing either. About people with very severe mental health issues, severe anxiety, severe depression, etc. I think that may happen. I don't think that's a particular risk to the sector. I think there's a little bit of toughening up of the sector regulations, if you like. So I'm still pretty positive about the UK market, but in the sense that it will continue to grow, but won't continue. In my view, I don't think it will continue to grow vastly quickly.
Okay, very interesting, Mike. And actually, in this slide, we are seeing some data, some of which has been recently published, the import data published yesterday by Business of Cannabis, as well as some estimates on the patient figures. And something that's a little bit striking from my perspective outside the UK is like how constant growth has been in the UK. It has been doubling year after year. Usually you see, like you were saying, either an exponential growth and then maybe some plateauing. And the UK, it's constant growth, which from my perspective, what I want to get your take as well, Mike, has to do with like how long it has taken for the infrastructure to actually grow in terms of the private clinics and everything surrounding. So it has been a little bit of, from my perspective, supply-led growth in the UK. So I want to ask you if you agree with this sentiment, Mike, and also what do you think in terms of the figures that we're showing? I think you mentioned that now, as of May 2026, you estimate we're almost 100,000 patients. Is that correct?
Yeah. I guess it's about that. But the trouble is we don't have a central repository of numbers. So nobody really knows the exact number. My guess, and I don't disagree with those figures from Business of Cannabis, I think they were at the end of last year, I think we're around 100,000 patients in the UK now. And I think we'll still see, as we said a bit earlier, we'll see that doubling. I think for the next 2 to 3 years, we will definitely see a plateau. Why are we seeing a plateau is because it's still at all literally 99.99% is in the private sector. In the private sector, you have to pay. The average amount is about £300 sterling a month, give or take, quite a lot. And that's a lot of money to a lot of people. And not everyone who needs cannabis can afford it, which is a dreadful criticism of the British system, frankly. So I think we'll see it plateauing at, I don't know the number, nor does anybody, but 200, 300,000 people. I think it will then plateau because we've reached the limit of those who can actually afford it privately. And what we desperately need to do in the next, well, from now onwards, in the next 2 or 3 years, is try and get the government and the medical bodies to agree that there should be a medicine available on the National Health Service. That's the big barrier we have at the moment. That's the big issue now.
Absolutely, Mike. And I think the data that we are seeing in this slide reflects what you were just saying. Here we are looking at it was also a recent Freedom of Information request asking for the number of items prescribed by each prescriber. And therefore, we could estimate that as of 2024, according to this official data by the NHS Business Service Authority, there were barely 200 prescribers, which if we are thinking that there was in 2024, let's say 40 or 50,000 patients, it's a very small prescriber population, right?
Yes.
So then, and we have also seen, of course, that the number of items prescribed and dispensed after prescriptions by each of these prescribers has been on the rise, of course, because there aren't really that many prescribers. So it makes sense that they are prescribing more and more. But then, Mike, beyond the NHS, which of course I assume could be a big driver of more momentum, how can we expand the prescriber population in Britain?
I wish I knew that. It is slowly increasing. The membership of the Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society is now about 540 members. Now, not all of those are prescribers. They can be open to any clinician, and clinician, not necessarily doctor, but clinician with an interest in cannabis. So we think we have most of the prescribers, not necessarily all, because there's no compulsion to join the society. But we know the number of prescribers is going up slowly but surely. I think from that slide you showed 166 last year. It's now, my guess, and again, it's only a guess, is probably we've gone back up to over 200. It's a bit dependent. Well, we've seen a drop in membership at MCCS following this recent negative campaign in the press. So I guess that some people thinking, oh, this is a little bit too difficult, a little bit too dangerous, but a little bit too dodgy for me to prescribe in this sector. I don't like it, so I'm going to leave. So it's a little bit press driven, and we do see a little bit of an uptick when there's a good article in the press, as there has been actually last week. So it's a bit interestingly driven by the media is the number of prescribers, interestingly, but it's going up slowly, which is good. How can we encourage more? Well, I think all we can keep doing from the MCCS and other bodies like the Cannabis Industry Council and Drug Science is to keep putting out positive stories about how this medicine can help people. And then hopefully at least some of the doctors and initial prescribers have to be medical doctors, of course, will think, okay, let me try this. I don't know anything about it. Let me learn about it. And there are facilities now to learn through the MCCS, for example, training programs, advanced training programs. Let's get interested in this. Let's have a look at it. Let's prescribe. And slowly but surely, I think the prescribers will go up. I think there'll be times when we're lagging behind. We haven't got enough prescribers for the population. Other times it catches up a little bit and lags behind again. So we will see moments of disparity, undoubtedly. But I think the market will continue to slowly grow.
Very, very interesting, actually. And do you think there can be any regulatory catalyst or any, now there's a review, I believe, an official review also of the medical cannabis regulations launched by this government. Is there anything that can happen that could facilitate the adoption by new prescribers?
In the private sector, no, it's relatively easy to get a prescription in the private sector. The negative is the cost, as we've said, and the government can't do anything about that. If it remains private, there's going to be a cost to it, sadly. I think what the government certainly can do is make it easier to prescribe in the NHS. There's a general medical reluctance to prescribe, but nevertheless, underneath that, there's quite a proportion of doctors will be happy to do so if it's easier to do it. And at the moment, without boring the audience too much with the details, if you want to prescribe on the National Health Service for a patient, you have to fill in a form called an independent funding review for each patient to show that they're not necessarily unique, but they've got exceptional clinical need. That takes quite a lot of effort by the doctor. At the moment, there's virtually no chance of it being successful. So what the government certainly could do is make that bureaucracy easier and perhaps centralize the IFR approval process so we don't get every individual hospital all around the country or any individual area looking in the country making different decisions for different reasons. We try and centralize it with central expertise and then make it easier for the NHS doctor to say or have agreed to prescribe for the patient. So there's things the government could do to make it easier to prescribe in the National Health Service, and that's what they should do. Because when the government changed the law in 2018, I don't think they were suggesting the law should only be changed to make it accessible for those with money for the private sector. They wanted to make it accessible for all who needed it, and they haven't done that. So the government has, in my view, a responsibility to make it easier. And we have an educational job to do to persuade those doctors who still look at it cynically that they're actually wrong.
Very insightful, Mike. And actually, on the same lines of what we were seeing, in this slide, we are looking at the concentration of the items dispensed by the prescriber that actually made the prescription for those items. And this data wasn't available until recently, but was really, really surprising to see. Because, for instance, we see that in 2019, which, of course, the market was very, very small. Yeah. We're talking under 2,000 patients. There was a single prescriber that accounted for half of the items prescribed. No, this has been reducing over time, but we have seen also in other markets, let's say in Australia, for instance, and elsewhere, there were some concerns regarding the super prescribers, or the concentration of prescriptions in very few doctors. So actually, from the 200 doctors that we were mentioning, we estimated that there were last year, and probably also similar number as of 2026. We see that even in the first half of 2025, the top 10 doctors were prescribing 43% of the items. And this has been reducing a lot more, but there's still one single prescriber, which accounts for 11% of the items prescribed, according to this data, which maybe you can nuance a little bit for us. Just for reference, this means that this one single doctor is prescribing over 9,000 items each month, or it's like, I don't know if they work every day of the week. I don't think so, but it seems a little bit difficult, no? So what's your interpretation of this data, Mike? And also,
Yeah,
do you think that concentration could be problematic or not really?
this is a fascinating slide. I think we should ignore the first few years because, as you say, the figures are skewed by the fact there was only, initially, of course, there was only 5 or 10 doctors prescribing in the whole country. So it wasn't difficult to prescribe 5, 10, 50, even 50% of those numbers. So I think we should ignore the first few years. They're sort of fairly meaningless statistics. If we look at the present statistic, it's explainable to some extent because there are some cannabis prescribers who really just do this as a full-time job now. Not many, but most do it as a part-time job. They still work in the NHS. They perhaps just do a one session, one morning, one afternoon a week or something. Therefore, they're never going to build up a massive percentage. Those doctors who do this more full-time are clearly going to dominate the market. So that explains the statistics to some extent. I think some of the statistics are also, frankly, wrong. I mean, I worked it out earlier this morning that if you're prescribing 9,000 prescriptions per month, that works out to 1 every minute for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 4 weeks of the month. There's no time for coffee, no time for lunch, no time to go to the toilet even. So, that can't be right. And I think what might, and I don't know the explanation, but I think what might be happening is the consultant is logged as the initial prescriber because he or she has to be, and it may be the subsequent follow-up prescriptions are also logged under that prescriber, even though follow-up prescribers are actually doing the follow-up prescriptions. That's the only way I can think of it. So I think there's something not quite right in those statistics, not your work, but the statistics you've got from the regulatory bodies that explains that. I mean, I'm worried only in the sense that if there are some doctors who are churning out prescriptions at 2 minutes a time, that's not proper medicine. And initially, particularly for the first appointment, you need time to talk to the patient, particularly those with severe issues like severe mental health issues. You need more time. You get in the UK, you get 5 minutes for a GP appointment, and I don't think that's enough for an initial appointment of something as complicated as cannabis. I think you need at least 15, 20 minutes, and in some complicated patients, at least half an hour is my view. So if you're doing it more quickly than that, I will be a little worried that you're not giving enough time to the patient to do a proper medical job. That's my concern. But I don't think necessarily that those statistics show that because we don't quite know what lies behind them. And if you work it out, if you're working pretty well full time, it's not that difficult to get to 3 to 4% of the market. If you're doing 5 days a week, perhaps even 10 patients a day or something, if you work out the statistics. So getting to be a 3, 4, 5% prescriber, if you do it full time, is not difficult because most of your colleagues are doing it very much part time. So it depends what lies underneath those statistics. I think most prescribers are very good. There may be a few prescribers who are just doing it too quickly. They're there to make money. I don't claim that all doctors are wonderful people. There are some perhaps rogues who just want to make money as quick as possible. I don't think anyone can deny that possibility. But I think probably the vast majority of prescribers do a good job. But we just need to keep an eye on perhaps those who are seeing patients or clinics that are forcing people to see appointments at too quick an interval. You need time to discuss with the patient. You need time to understand why they need it, what they need, what sort of medicine they need. It takes time. It's not something you can do bang, bang, bang when you shouldn't do it that quickly. That's a
fascinating explanation, what you said regarding the repeat prescription.
Yeah.
So perhaps it reflects more on the concentration of clinics rather than necessarily that there's this super prescriber working overtime. But I mean, I think it's relevant because let's say in Poland, for instance, that for a while had a vibrant telemedicine sector, as most people is aware now. They were calling it not laundromat, but like receptomat, like
yes.
And
So we've got to be careful of that. I mean, we want this as a proper accepted medicine. And to do that, you've got to make it a proper consultation, a thought through, sensible, balanced discussion with the patient about what's wrong with them, what their need is, what sort of cannabis they'll need. And that cannot be done in a couple of minutes. First timer. Follow-up prescription is different. If they're set on a medicine and it's no side effects and they're carrying on nicely, you can do a follow-up prescription very quickly, perfectly validly. But the initial prescription, certainly, and perhaps the first follow-up, the second follow-up, does need time. And I'd be slightly worried from those figures, just slightly worried that some are not giving the necessary time.
Very interesting to keep in mind. And also some other issue that has come to the attention of regulators in other markets. I haven't seen it laid out this way in the UK, same as super prescribers. I never saw it really as a topic of as a problematic topic. But essentially, in this slide, we have the main online clinics in the UK by the traffic on their websites. Of course, big caveat, this doesn't equate to patients, prescriptions, revenue, any figure. It just reflects the traffic. But of course, we know that likely if they have a 500,000 visits each month, they probably have a lot of prescriptions as well, no? And in other markets that maybe have a relatively similar regulatory architecture, let's say like in Australia, now there's a big review as well of their scheme. And one of the issues that was mentioned by the regulators as problematic was the closed loop system, called like that, which means that there's networks of clinics, distributors, suppliers, and pharmacies that therefore make choice for patients a little bit more problematic, and essentially they gain a little bit of a monopolistic position in the market. Yes. I'm not implying that this is the case in the UK, but if we look at this online traffic data, we see that the top 3 clinics, online clinics, this is also a big caveat, the physical might be another story as well, but the top 3 clinics account for over 2/3 of the traffic. It doesn't equate to prescriptions, but it points to a certain concentration. Do you think this is, well, first, Mike, do you think this could be problematic? And we know there's over 40 clinics right now, online clinics at least, prescribing in the UK. So what does this data tell us about the evolution of the market in the UK? Could this be problematic or not really?
Again, a lot of questions, a lot of thought in there. There are roughly 40 or so clinics. Some will always be small because they're perhaps one or two doctors just doing it, and it's perfectly valid, so they'll never have a big volume. Some are niche in terms of they only perhaps prescribe for neurological indications or psychiatric, so they're never going to be big because they're not a generic cannabis clinic. And there's nothing wrong with that. They're perfectly good clinics. In one sense, I'm not worried about those 3, 4, 5 clinics dominating the market. I presume that means that first of all, they're generic clinics, so they've got a lot more doctors, a lot more staff, and they see people with any condition that may be suitable for cannabis medicine. So they're bound to be bigger. And I presume they attract the patients and keep the patients, more importantly, because they do a good job. They're efficient. People are seen quickly, they get the prescription quickly, etc., etc. So in a sense, the market will dictate that to a degree. People like going to them, as long as they like going to them for the right reason. So superficially, I have no problem with that, with 4 or 5 clinics dominating. It's up to the others to catch up. If they want to open a big generic clinic, do the job and get there. I'm a little worried about the restriction. As you say, there is some sort of closed loop clinics with producers providing a clinic, providing a pharmacy. That is really, really important that the doctors in the clinic, the prescribers in the clinic can prescribe whatever's right for that patient and not just what's on that formulary from that one importer. In fact, that's the law in the UK. That's the regulation. You cannot prescribe only from a fixed formulary. So as long as those clinics enable the doctors, if it's appropriate, to prescribe outside their own formulary, and also send the prescription to any pharmacy that the patient chooses, that's also important. What's called script direction cannot happen either. You can't force the patient to take the prescription to your pharmacy. Commercially, I can see why they want to do that, because that's how they make their money. Clinics generally don't make much money. It's the pharmacists that make the money. So pushing the patients to your pharmacy is commercially sensible. And it's okay as long as it's not clinically restricting the doctor from doing what's right for that patient. That's the key point to it. And as long as those clinics, to broaden it out slightly, the MCCS has now produced what's called best practice guidance, which just simply, I don't think they're controversial indications. They tell the clinics or advise the clinics what good practice looks like in terms of appointment times, in terms of training, in terms of supervision of the prescriber. So they're relatively straightforward, hopefully non-arguable best practice guidelines. And as long as the clinics are adhering to those guidelines, then I have no problem with volume, if that makes sense. So I would encourage the clinics and anyone listening to look at the UK MCCS website. On there's our best practice guide. Look at it, read it, and if you're a prescriber, adhere to those best practice guidelines. And to be blunt, don't get bossed about by the clinic management. You are the prescriber. You have the right to prescribe the right thing for that patient in front of you. Do that and don't be pushed by the clinic. I'm not saying that happens, but make sure it doesn't happen.
That's super insightful, Mike. And yeah, of course, the formularies in other markets, this has been also very relevant. Just one quick mention on the relevance of this data as well is, before we were mentioning the doubling, the market was doubling year on year. So we also see the traffic doubling year on year, just for the just to mention why this data is relevant. But at the same time, let's say we see some clinics, for instance, the leader, let's say, apparently losing traffic and others gaining it. But of course, this might reflect, let's say, strategies in terms of search engine optimization and so on.
Yeah, exactly. It's very market driven. Sure. Other clinics coming on board, etc. Some putting a lot of money into marketing. It's in a sense, sadly, but it's rather marketing driven. But there's a limit to what you can market in the UK. You can't market product, but you can market the existence of a clinic. It's all a little bit of a grey, slightly, it's a slightly grey area. And some people have the budget to push the marketing, and the marketing helps.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, I lost a little bit of my camera, but no worries. We can continue this way until I manage to fix it.
Okay.
No problem, because people are here to look at you, Mike, not at me. So no problem. So now we're looking at the data from another Freedom of Information request that was, and this is the one that Cannamonitor analyzed with over 150,000 item lines. And what we see is, of course, again, the doubling year on year, which we see because by the first half of 2025, we're already at a similar number of items as in 2024. So this points at a significant growth trend. But also, when we analyze the products in terms of which formats of products are being prescribed, this is also highly interesting, because, correct me if you see it differently, Mike, but at the beginning, the first years of the UK market, there was a lot more oils, let's say, and there has been a big trend towards the flower over the years, which we have seen. I believe in 2022, it was something like 72%, then 2023, close to 80%, and then we see in 2024, it was almost 84% of the items prescribed were flower items. And this is due to the declining share of oils, let's say. And this trend has shifted in 2025. I believe it's very interesting because we have seen this also in other international markets. And this is not due to a sudden surge in oil prescriptions. It rather comes from the fact that new dosage forms have been introduced in the market. And this is particularly the vapes. There were also some capsules before, but then that we label as oral solids. But from in recent quarters, let's say, we also have now some pastille SKUs that have been launched into the market. And if we look at the trend, For instance, in the first half of 2025, the vapes were already sold, let's say, double as in the whole 2024. So vapes were tripling year on year in 2025, according to the data from the first half, and also oral solids were more than doubling. This doesn't mean that flower is not growing, because to be fair, it still constitutes the far majority of the market, and it's growing very, very fast. I cannot say exactly the same thing about oils. They are growing, but at a slightly lower pace. But essentially, this is the main insight that I got from this data. Essentially, that perhaps this change towards flower is it maybe over? Are we maybe in a new phase of the UK market where we're going to get a lot new dosage forms that are going to be able to gain market share? What do you think, Mike?
Well, I hope that's right. And I'm not in any sense anti-flower, but if you compare ourselves to other international markets, our proportion of flower prescribing is much more. I mean, I think you know the figures better than I do, Arnau, but I think you said earlier about 50%. Flower is perhaps about right in the States and Canada, maybe 50, 55, 60%, but not 83, 84%. So we've got a big dependence on flower. And part of that reason, not all of it, but part of it, is we're lacking in anything else. As you say, we've got oils. We have, I think the number's about just under 100 different oils, but just under 400 different flowers. But what we don't have is virtually anything of other formats, ignoring the vape cartridges, if you count them as flower in a sense. We've got one suppository is just on the market literally in the last week or so. Pessaries, likewise, virtually none. Virtually no capsules, gummies, no creams, very few sprays, all of which are valid, all of which may help a proportion of the patients that are currently having flower because there's nothing else to take. So I think it's really important for the consumer, for the patient, and for the doctor's choice to have other formats around. And when we see those other formats come in, as we are now beginning to see, we will see the proportion of flower decline. Of that, there's no doubt. I think also flower was driven initially quite strongly by the experienced patient who obtained flower on the illegal market, because there's not much else on the illegal market, and quite right, they've got used to flower, they know what flower they want, absolutely fine to get it prescribed. But now we're seeing a higher proportion, slowly but surely, of naive users who've never tried cannabis before, who are coming to the cannabis prescribing market, who are perhaps a little bit more open to the doctor advising a different format, like it's starting off with an oil. I know a lot of patients don't like oil, they don't like the taste, they don't like the effect, they prefer the effect of the flower, and indeed, some, particularly those with severe pain, need a flower vape for the breakthrough pain, for the sudden onset of the pain. So absolutely nothing wrong with flower. It will always be, in my view, at least 50% of the market. But I think we do need to see it reducing, in the sense that we need other formats that will take some of that market away from the flower for good, valid clinical reasons. We really need to drive in this country other formats. And I don't know why we've been so slow to do it. Other formats are around in the world. It's not as though we have to reinvent everything. So why the UK has been so slow at introducing suppositories and pessaries and capsules and everything else, I don't know. But at long last, we're beginning to see it creeping in.
That's very interesting, Mike. And I don't know the answer either, but I might say it might have something to do with economies of scale. Like in a larger market, it's easier that smaller SKUs, let's say, make sense. And actually, if we look at some of the, in 2022 and 2023, there were some initial launches of things like soft gels, even some vapes by some brands.
Yeah.
Sorry?
And yes, and they disappeared from the market, didn't they?
And they disappeared from the market, exactly.
Yes.
And it's probably because they weren't selling that good, because it's not only about having the availability, it's also about having the education of the doctors, having the route to market, let's say, no?
Yeah. The MTCS is now producing documentation and webinars to make the prescribers more aware of the value of different formats, the different pharmacokinetics of the different formats, when they might be valuable. I think you're right. I mean, if you're not trained and don't understand the value of a suppository, when you might use it, in what circumstance, you're going to keep back to what you're used to, which is flour and oil. So I think it's availability on one side, but it's education very much on the other side for the prescriber and for the patients as well.
That's super interesting.
I very much hope we'll see those other formats push in towards the rest of 2026 and certainly into 2027. I hope we'll see that.
Absolutely. When I started in this market in 2018, I remember there was already talks regarding the switch to extracts. Like people were expecting already for the market to go towards the oils and even more advanced nano-emulsions.
Yes.
And now there's a lot of course, let's say the solventless trend, which has also arrived in the UK. There's now some vapes that are resin and rosin based vapes, for instance. So all these things are really interesting. It has taken 7 or 8 years, not just a couple quarters like some Canadian companies were expecting. But
yeah, exactly. The proportion of flower has gone up rather than gone down, and that is a bit of a mystery. But let's hope that trend reverses soon.
Absolutely. And another super interesting trend that we're always keeping track of is, of course, the evolution of potency trends. And here in this slide, we are looking at the volumes dispensed in the periods that we were mentioned by the potency band of products. And first, of course, CBD and balanced remains a very limited category. But we see actually dramatic shift from 2022 to 2025. So for instance, the 28% or more category, it was virtually absent in 2023. I think the first launches were around 2023, but it only started showing in the data in 2024. And now as of 2025, it already accounts for almost 1 in 5 flower products that are being dispensed to British patients, which is significantly. And this reflects as well, of course, in the average potency of high THC products. We are not including the balanced and CBD in this assessment, but we see that in 2022 it was close to 20%, and then in 2025 we see it close to 24%, which is quite a big increase. And however, if we take, let's say, an international perspective in this regard, I must say that, and of course this also has to do with testing rules, let's say, and things like that, but compared to North America, the UK would still be considered a less mature market in terms of potency. So for instance, in Canada, if you look at the products available in the Ontario Cannabis Store, it's almost everything close to 30% THC. Even if we look at Germany, which has also had this trend of higher and higher potency of flower products being dispensed in the pharmacy, we see that Germany is still a little bit more mature, closer perhaps to 25% on average for flower products. The UK is 24%. It's still growing, but we also see that the curve, perhaps because it's only the first half of 2025, but perhaps due to other factors, it's perhaps slowing down. So I believe that if you talk with players in the supply chain, suppliers and so on, they are still very much interested in high potency products because they know they move faster. Usually they can command a little bit of higher prices. But however, an interesting trend in the beginning of 2025 is the resurgence of products between 16 and 20% THC, which some people were already thinking that they weren't viable anymore. However, particularly I've seen new brands or sub brands focus on smalls, on popcorn, it said, smaller flowers which tend to be slightly lower potency. This seems to have really driven a resurgence through budget offerings of this lower potency, even if it looks like the demand is still trending towards the higher potency. And I guess the big question here, Mike, that I would like you to answer is, because of course we see some elements of it are supply driven. There are simply a lot more SKUs in the market that are higher potency, but perhaps there's also some trends from the prescribers, or maybe it's just the patient preference that's driving the higher potency. So are the three reasons valid, or which one do you think is the dominant driver of this THC inflation, in your opinion, Mike?
Yeah, well, first thing to say is we need, as clinicians, the range of THC. We need low THC, 15, 20%. We need middle 20, 25, and 25 plus. We need that. Some patients will need a higher THC, particularly those with severe pain. Some will benefit from lower THC. I think there's a little bit of a fallacy in the market that the higher the THC, the better the medicine. That is not the case. And some people don't like me saying that, but it is not the case. We did an analysis of the T21 drug science data. It's not yet published, but we looked at the efficacy against pain for 3 bands: less than 20%, 20 to 25%, and 25% plus. And the number of there was no trend to get a better efficacy the higher the THC. So basically, that means the same number of people were suited by low THC as were suited by medium THC as were suited by high THC. So it doesn't mean that you do not necessarily need high THC to help with your problems, like your pain. Some do, some don't. And if anything, just to make a sort of another point, there's people are aware there's a finite volume in the trichomes in the flower. There's several thousand trichomes, whatever, in each flower, but there's nevertheless, they're tiny volume, there's a finite volume. And the maximum is probably around 30% dried weight. So the more you fill that volume up with one product like THC, the less room there is, to put it very crudely and simplistically, but the less room there is for the minor cannabinoids and the terpenes. And for many people, it's those minor cannabinoids and terpenes that add to the medical value. So the higher and higher and higher the THC you get, I'm not going to say almost, the less and less the medical value. Not for everybody, but it is wrong to say the higher the THC, we need high THC for good medical product. We do not. We need a range of THC products, including some high CBD ones as well. So I think part of the high THC is supply driven. There's something from some of the producers that say, look, this is a wonderful new product. It's 29% THC. We're really enthusiastic about it. Well, you should be enthusiastic about it if it works as a medicine. But it is slightly supply driven. I don't actually think it's prescriber driven. There's a little bit of a reaction from the prescribers about jumping in with high THC products. And indeed, our best practice guidance now says that if you want to prescribe a product higher than 25% THC, that's fine, but you need peer group approval to do so. And that really it covers the doctor who might be wrongly accused of jumping in with a high THC product that looks like there's recreational use when it isn't. So it helps the doctor justify, if you like, the use of high THC. And doctors will tend, or they should tend, to try to start a new patient, a naive patient, with low THC, see how it helps, move, if necessary, move up to medium THC, and if necessary, move up to high THC. That should be the natural escalation trend. And that, I think, will be one reason why I think we'll see the high THC is plateauing, if not reducing to an extent. So we're still seeing a push from the supply side, a little bit of a push from the patient side as well. There's a little bit of something in the ether that tells patients the higher the THC, the better the medicine. And I think we need to make clear that that is not necessarily the case. But we're not seeing a push from the prescribers, to be honest.
That's super insightful, Mike. And actually, I must add another data perspective here. If you just run the average THC on the SKUs, it's a little bit lower because it's not volume weighted. What does it mean? That usually, also if you look brand by brand, which are the top selling products, let's say it tends to skew slightly towards stronger products. And maybe it's because, in part, because of what you were saying, that it's the main labeled active ingredient, of course. So there might be this, it's perhaps not correct, but we might have this tendency to consider it higher quality because it's the only thing that we can label. But I'm happy that something that I have already been seeing in Australia for perhaps about a year, and of course in North America since before, which is labeling as well some minor cannabinoids. And now we have some products in the UK that are, for instance, high CBG, which wasn't the case a couple of years ago or 1 year ago. And this is a really, really good trend, I would say, and same with the terpenes.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's been so, I think the producers have some criticism here that they've labeled THC and CBD. They've never really labeled, up to recently, the minor cannabinoid profile and the terpene profile, let alone the flavonoid profile. We still don't see that. And I think it's so important. The minor cannabinoids are really, really important in terms of the medical value of the plant. As you say, CBG, very, very good for a very strongly anti-inflammatory. CBC, very good also for inflammation, particularly skin inflammation like eczema and such like. CBN, very good for sleep. And the terpenes are so critical here. Myrcene for helping with sedation, etc., etc. Linalool for epilepsy. I mean, we can go on forever. But the terpene profile is really key. And at last, we're seeing more and more of the suppliers producing a certificate of analysis that lists the minor cannabinoids and lists the terpenes. And it's only by so doing that the prescribers can begin to know, well, this one really worked for sleep, and this one really worked for inflammatory bowel disease. So until we know what is in the product we're actually prescribing, we're not going to know that. So I think the doctors are at last able to understand that from the certificate analysis and therefore the chemovar. And I'm very against, this is probably be controversial again, the naming of this, let's call them strains. These rather silly recreational names don't actually mean anything except at a very crude level. You know that this particular one may produce a high THC plant, this one produces perhaps a little lesser THC, but those names don't actually mean anything. It's the chemovar that means it. And as anyone who grows the stuff knows, if you plant the same genetic seed and grow it in different environments, you'll get very much different final chemovar out of it. So we need to know as prescribers what the chemovar is, and I don't care what the recreational name is. To hell with that. I don't care if I also, be more controversial hopefully, but I don't care if it's sativa or indica either. There's a general truth that indicas promote sedation and sleep, and sativas don't. But that's only a general truth. And again, it's the chemovar that determines the clinical effect, and it's the chemovar that the prescriber needs to be aware of. And the more we see the minor cannabinoids and terpene profiles in the products and in the labels, the more we'll understand and produce better medicine.
Super interesting, Mike. Just one mention on the indica sativa, because I ran the analysis, but same as you, I don't consider it that insightful. No. But let's say that the trends are still same as in previous years. Most of it are hybrids, to be completely fair, even if they are indica or sativa leaning. But let's say sativa leaning hybrids account for about 1/4 of the market, let's say, and indicas dominate, let's say, most of the offerings. Also, some of the producers would say because they tend to be more productive, they tend to be higher, more metabolites, and this type of thing. But this is super relevant.
So, I don't, there's a sort of urban myth about sativas and indicas, and of course there's some general truth, but I'm not interested in general truth between sativa and indica effects. I'm interested in exact truth of what is actually in it and what that's going to do, and that's the chemovar. So we should abandon sativa and indica and abandon silly recreational names. There you go.
Amazing.
And now I'm going to be hugely criticized in the question and answer session.
Let's see. We're approaching actually our Q&A. So please, everybody that's following, I see it's already a very active comment section. Let's do this last slide on product innovation, and then let's focus on answering some questions. So here we see two different data sets. On the left, we have current product availability. And I must say that, of course, products come out of stock and then they come back in the market. So it's not super exact, let's say, because it can change every week. But of course, we see that in terms of product availability, flowers are highly dominant, and in particular, high THC flowers. And then on the right side of the image, this is not product availability, but rather volume by each of the formats. And we see that there's some discrepancies, which might point to interesting opportunities in the portfolios for producers. So for instance, when we look at the oral liquids, we see that there's about 82 that were in stock a couple of weeks ago. And we see that most of those are actually high THC. Whereas when we look at the actual prescription dispensation, we see that it's mostly balanced that are getting prescribed. And there's a little bit of this. You could get it even more granular to detect interesting product development opportunities, but also, like Mike was just mentioning, very interesting trend is the launch of new dosage forms. And this is not only new types of vapes, like I mentioned, like resin and rosin vapes, or new types of pastilles, which you can do also rosin infused. You can do a lot of different things in that space. But for instance, the ointments that have been, they were already in the market. I don't know if manufactured like Bespoke or how, but there were some prescriptions before. But now there's a reference by Curaleaf in the market, and also the suppository and pessary, which was also announced by Curaleaf, and I believe even some other brand has announced the intention to launch these products. So we are seeing that one of the big drivers of growth in the UK market is product innovation. And this ties everything together because it's the clinical need with the industry. And this is how we're moving forward after all. No? So, Mike, where do you see the biggest opportunities in terms of product development, and what would you like to see more of in the UK market by the producers? Now that you have many of them in the comment section following this webinar, what would you ask them?
Well, I think it emphasised what I've said and you've said before. We desperately need different formats. We need suppositories, we need pessaries, we need sprays, we need different forms of tablets, etc. That's really, really important. But on top of that, there's a real opportunity for some of the producers to come up with different products that are dominant in different minor cannabinoids and particularly in terpenes, and tell us what's in them. I think that should be compulsory, is to tell us what the minor cannabinoid and terpene profile is. And I'm a great fan of the forgotten flavonoids. You know, and let's do one thing at once. Let's get terpenes right. But there's a lot of real medical benefit for some of the flavonoids, and they are never reported. Never reported. I've never seen them. A significant analysis of flavonoids. I know they're difficult to analyze. I know they're more volatile, etc., etc. But they're in the plant. They add to the medical value. So let's see those as well. So the producers have got a long way to go to tell us what's in their product. And you could go to a supermarket and buy a packet of crisps, and they have to tell you exactly what's in that packet at the supermarket. So why on earth, as prescribing a medicine, we should know, we should be mandated to tell us exactly what is in this product that I'm about to give to this patient. And keeping the flavonoids from us, keeping the terpenes from us, even keeping the minor cannabinoids from us is simply wrong. And it's time they stopped it.
That's so interesting, Mike. And may I ask you, beyond the certificate of analysis, is there anything that the suppliers can do to improve their medical communication? What are the doctors missing in terms of information from the producers, or do you think it's mostly the certificate of analysis?
Well, it's also understanding what behind the certificate of analysis. And I know it's difficult for producers. I've been a bit harsh on them just now, but it's not difficult because it's an unlicensed product and you can't tell the world that you've got this brand new product and what's in it. So the marketing is very difficult in the UK. I accept that entirely. But I think the manufacturers, the producers certainly could be more open to education about the terpenes. I mean, the MCCS is doing this, but we don't want to be a monopoly telling the world about what's in their education. Producers who know a lot about what's in their own products should also tell us what's in it. What is the value? Why do we want something that's high in myrcene? Why do we want something that's high in linalool? Why did we, tell us? And education is perfectly legitimate. So I think the producers have almost an obligation to be more educative, not about their specific product, because they can't be, but about the generalization of what's valuable for this condition and what's valuable for that condition. Educate.
Super insightful, Mike. So, okay, we have 7 more minutes left, so let's go through some questions. You were right, you were a little bit polemic, and after you said that, there were a lot more comments coming on.
I expect that.
But Thomas Kelly agrees with you. He says that the mix of active compounds along with THC can make a big difference. But then we have, for instance...
Yep, I agree entirely, yeah.
But then we have, for instance, Stephen Painter mentioning that regarding the strain names that you mentioned were a little bit recreational. According to him, hazes, which would be more like a typical sativa, are more stimulating. Kushas, which are more like indica, would be more sedating.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. There's a generic truth to these things: sativa versus indica versus whatever. They wouldn't have grown up over the many, many years without some truth behind them. My point, perhaps I overstated it, but doesn't matter, is that we need to know more detail than just cushies are sedating. Yes, sure, but what's in them that makes them sedating? What else can we add to it to make them even more sedating or a little less sedating? So we need that subtlety as prescribers. We don't want generalizations.
And then Mitchell Ozak, which is a Canadian consultant, he's saying every pharmaceutical product has a brand name. So Ozempic compared to Gorilla Glue is not more of a silly name, Gorilla Glue compared to Ozempic.
Well, I'm fundamentally different with that. I mean, if we're going to get this accepted as a medicine by doctors at the moment who are not convinced about the efficacy of cannabis, they are not going to be able, or they're going to want to prescribe Gorilla Glue. Can you imagine a middle-class doctor in Middle England prescribing to a middle-class patient in Middle England? That's what we're talking about, generally speaking. I'm going to give you a gram a day of Gorilla Glue, because it's not going to make this as a mainstream medicine. And I want this as a mainstream medicine. It should be a mainstream medicine. And we're not helping the adoption as a mainstream medicine to those who are cynical about it by calling them Gorilla Glue, or even worse names, frankly, that I won't repeat here, but we all know about. They are silly in the sense of they don't help the adoption of cannabis as a medicine by mainstream medical practitioners.
Interesting.
So, sorry, Mitchell, I disagree with you.
Okay, and then David, before at the beginning we were talking about how to expand the prescriptions and the prescriber base, he's mentioning NICE will only generate a pathway based on both economic and randomized clinical trials, evidence-based arguments. So points to what regulators tend to say all the time, that is, we don't have sufficient evidence, we need more clinical trials, but at the same time, medical cannabis is not a licensed pharmaceutical. So what do you make of this?
It never will be. It's a botanical. Strangely, it's not a pharmaceutical. And pushing it down a pharmaceutical path, and NICE, Dave's quite right, NICE have an obligation to push things down a pharmaceutical path because that's their remit, that's their terms and conditions, if you like, but it doesn't lend itself to a pharmaceutical path. Cannabis does not, I repeat, does not lend itself to double-blind placebo-controlled studies, unless you've got an isolate. Then it does, like Sativex or Epidiolex, fine. But the whole full spectrum plant does not lend itself to us. It doesn't, pushing it down a pharmaceutical route isn't going to work. We have to develop a botanical pathway of licensing. And one exists, traditional herbal medicine, as a licensing pathway does exist. It looks more in Europe than it does in the UK, but that is a pathway. It doesn't apply at the moment to cannabis because it's not designated legally as a traditional herbal medicine. But it wouldn't take much thought from the politicians to adjust a botanical pathway to encompass licensed cannabis. And then, to hell with NICE, we need a botanical NICE. We don't need a present NICE. So let's not push cannabis down a pharmaceutical route in which it does not fit.
So interesting. But in the last year, Mike, like we've been now for maybe a decade that we only had dronabinol, Sativex, Epidiolex. In the last year, we had, for instance, the botanical trial out of Germany that was very, very good results for chronic pain. In Australia, I'm seeing now also some of these investigational products are really getting good results in clinical trials. So you see it as a separate pathway, but that doesn't necessarily impact medical cannabis as a full spectrum, more like an officinal product, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, there are pathways to exist. And I think, to generalize, Europe does this better than the UK, particularly since Brexit. Brexit hasn't helped in many ways, but I shouldn't get too political, should I? But, the botanical approval pathway in Europe is a little bit more open to putting botanical plants down that route than we are in the UK at the moment. And I don't know much about the botanical route in other countries, you can tell me. But we do need the government to look carefully at licensing botanical medicines, and in fullness of time, mushrooms as psilocybins as well will fall outside the classic pharmaceutical pathway. So we need to open up a licensing pathway so the public and the doctors can be reassured that the products are properly licensed, but it's not going to be a pharmaceutical pathway.
Okay, super interesting.
Pathway.
Okay, let's go to our last question. We have 1 minute left. Grace is asking, should we not be looking to use more cannabinoid-related drug products rather than flower? And she's mentioning in particular high-dose CBD formulations for which there is now quite a bit of good clinical evidence, particularly in psychiatry. The NHS has already expressed interest in research for CBD. So I think there's two things, like other formats apart from flower, but also because we saw before that CBD is almost non-existent in the market, apart from 8% of the oil market, let's say, which is very tiny.
Yeah.
So what do you make of this, Mike?
I think, Grace, you're absolutely right. We need more high-dose CBD formulations, which are definitely the right thing for epilepsy, definitely the right thing for anxiety, for example. Yes, we do. I think, and we could push this down through the isolate pathway. And indeed, as we've said, Sativex and Epidiolex and virtually isolates. But we lose then, I'm a great believer in the entourage effect, that the full spectrum product is as a better medicine than the individual isolates. And that's what my point was, that it's difficult to push full spectrum products down the licensing route. But yes, we do need more cannabinoid related drug products, but they should not be more isolates. They should be more full spectrum products because they simply work better as a medicine. Less dose, less side effects, and work better. Simple. And we haven't got the pathway to do that.
It's a great great ending note. Actually, we have went over the hour. I see there's a few more comments, but we have run out of time. Please do not hesitate to contact us through LinkedIn. I think this was an amazing conversation. So thank you so much, Mike. I'm sure that it's going to have a lot of success, and we're going to share it during the next days. So yeah, any questions you have, do not hesitate to comment on LinkedIn, and see you on the next edition. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you, Arnau. Thank you.